For this edition, we found one of the most popular professors in our faculty here at Boston College, professor in our philosophy department. Brian is also the director of our Perspectives program. He teaches in the Wood School for Advancement Studies. We couldn't have found a better general editor or guest editor for this edition. Welcome, and to tell us about it is Brian Braman.
Thanks, Tom. One of the things I've learned over the years is that if you can, always have an Irishman introduce you, because he basically takes dross and turns it into gold. And so for Tom, I'm eternally grateful. I remember, maybe it was a year ago, I can't remember now the time frame, but when Karen had emailed me, Karen Kiefer emailed me about if I'd like to be the guest editor for this edition. And I said, yeah, sure, that sounds exciting. So I met with her and I think Bob Newton, and we talked about it. And one of the things that I eventually learned is how much work Karen really does. I mean, I knew she worked hard, but the work that she has done just in terms of the center and putting this magazine together is just unbelievable. And her and assistant Ellie. So again, I just want to give them another round of applause for the tremendous work that they've done. And I must confess, I'm not even sure how the theme came up for this magazine. I know we had conversations, and in the course of those conversations, I think it just seemed to kind of emerge organically about how important stories are in shaping our faith life. Now, for some of you, for most of you, probably think, well, that's not a big insight. I mean, of course we've known that stories are important. But I'm not sure that, at least the way I think about it, is that oftentimes I think we think about stories in a much narrower way. And I think this magazine is an attempt to broaden our horizon and to think about the ways in which our lives are shaped by all different kinds of narratives that come our way. This was at the beginning of an original essay I had written. And I'm going to start with this because I think it's just important to set the context for how we're going to go forward in this talk. And I'll be finished by the Super Bowl in January, so no worries. So some of you may be familiar with Augustine's Confessions. And Augustine tells a story, and the Confessions are a story. It's a story of his life, and it's a story of the way in which he was questing to find God. And oftentimes I tell my students, you read the Confessions, and the way he talks about his early life, it sounds like a bad country and western song, right? Looking for love in all the wrong places. But in Book 8, he tells the story. He's in a garden, and he hears the children singing. And they're singing this song, and part of the refrain is Tolle lege, take and read. Take and read. He heard this, he picks up the scriptures, and he begins to start reading a passage. And it was at that moment then that, as it were, his eyes were open and he began the full journey to his conversion and embracing the Catholic faith. But the thing is about Augustine is that this reading of experience was set by his experience of reading other authors, people that we would not normally place in the context of a faith journey. He read the Neoplatonists, had a profound influence on his own intellectual and faith life. He read Cicero and Cicero's work, the Hortensius. And so it was reading these works and the desire to read that set the conditions for what eventually happened to him in the garden. So there's a lot of different ways that we can think about storytelling. And the stories that are important in terms of the struggle of our own faith. Stories that help lead us to a richer understanding, to the light, a richer experience of the light of our faith, or perhaps stories that in many ways challenge what we believe, get us to rethink what we believe, or perhaps point out to us the ways in which we have fallen short of the mark. Let me just read from you a passage from a book that I forgot to bring up. If you're not familiar with this Japanese author, I would suggest that you familiarize yourself with Shusaku Endo. And this is his book, The Samurai. And it's a historical fiction, and it takes place in 17th century Japan. And the main character is a samurai. He's a low-level samurai. He works for one of the feudal lords, and he's been sent on this diplomatic mission to Rome with a couple Franciscans. And let me just read to you his experience of what it's like to be among these Christians. Because every time I read this, I always think, you know, there's something so patently true about what it is he's saying, and so I have to remind myself about why I am committed to the story that I tell about my Christian life. So he's saying to himself, I have no desire to worship you, he murmured almost apologetically. I can't even understand why the foreigners respect you. They say you died bearing the sins of mankind, but I can't see that our lives have become any easier as a result. I know what wretched lives the peasants lead in the marshland. Nothing has changed just because you died. To the samurai, the life of Jesus seemed bizarre. Without ever knowing a man, his mother had given birth to him in a stable, and when it was all finished, she had quietly become the wife of a carpenter. Yet from the time of his birth, Jesus had been appointed as the king who would save men and nations, and answering the call of heaven, he had abandoned his native land and practiced the ascetic life under a priest named John. At length, Jesus returned to his own country, acquired many disciples, showed forth wondrous works. It goes on, and then paragraph finishes. Then 3 days later, he was restored to life in the tomb and ascended to heaven. The samurai could not understand how a man like Velasco, the Franciscan priest, could believe a story so palpably absurd. I mean, this is an absurd story in many ways. And so to read someone like Endo, who has a real sense of what it's like to be a non-Western to encountering this story, I think it's a wonderful opportunity for us to kind of re-understand why we commit ourselves to something from the eyes of someone from a different culture sees this thing as so patently absurd. But you know, there's another story that I'd like to tell, and it's a non-traditional story in the sense that it doesn't fit into the way in which we think about narratives. Oftentimes we talk about myths, right? And myths we tend to assume are things that are false. But myth actually comes from the Greek mythos, which just means stories. Science is a myth. Math is a myth. Sociology is a myth. You name it, they're all myths. It doesn't mean they're not true, but what it means is they're narratives. They're narratives about particular elements or aspects of a larger story. So I'd like to suggest that when we think of story in the broader context, I'd like to think about the way in which our commitment to the liberal arts here is a commitment to a story about the way in which God's self-story is being revealed in human history, and the ways in which that self-story is either accepted or denied. Oftentimes, I don't think we even associate mathematics, biology, chemistry, or any of these other disciplines with stories that can help us shape or form or appreciate our faith in a richer way. We tend to think, I have to study this, I have to study this, I have to study this. Over the years, I've always thought that really, if we think about the liberal arts, if we think about them in a rich way, there's a way in which this story that unfolds is a story about, again, God's self-story and the different ways that God's self-story gets communicated. But also we can see the ways in which God's self-story somehow is being prevented from manifesting itself completely. So that means being aware of the history of our own culture, being aware of the ways in which stories are told that prevent God's self-story from actually being palpable and present to us. The story then that I'm telling is a story that is rooted in I think, one of the greatest gifts that we've been given. It's our intellect. Augustine was clear that the human intellect is the created participation in the uncreated light. That is, our intelligence is a created participation in God's own eternal act of self-understanding, which is a pretty powerful way to think about the stories that we encounter in a whole variety of ways. So if you think about your intellect as this created participation in uncreated light, so rarely then is there something that we're not going to encounter that at least can't suggest to us the possibility of perhaps seeing how God is revealing God's self to us in this kind of story. One of the shortest stories ever written that for me, and I can't say I really know much about it, but for me kind of encapsulates this, what I'm trying to say about God's revealing himself in story. E equals MC squared. That's a great story. That's a profound story. And it's a story about the universe that God has created, the universe that God has given us, and the nature of that universe. And in that story, God is saying something about God's own intelligence, God's own goodness, and what that means. My great friend and mentor, Father Flanagan, who died a number of years ago, when he was helping me try and learn this stuff, he said, what's really interesting about this element of E equals MC squared is eventually God is telling us that there's a speed limit to the universe. Right? Can't go any faster. You know, if you're on 128, 55 doesn't mean anything. But the universe has a limit that you can't actually transgress. So to think about God's self-story is to really think in a broader way about finding God in all things. I'm not talking about Christian math or Christian biology, but what I'm talking about is the wonder and awe that can be experienced in encountering these kinds of stories. Here at BC, we throw this phrase around all the time, finding God in all things, right? And I'm sorry if sounds a bit sacrilegious, but sometimes it sounds like, where's Waldo? Because the phrase rolls off our lips and it's so easy, but it's really hard. It is really hard finding God in all things. And if you think that I'm onto something here by thinking about the intellectual grasp of our own tradition as Westerners, as an opportunity to find God's presence and God's story, then it demands a level of attentiveness. You know what it's like to be a good reader. You have to be attentive. You have to pay attention. You have to be in touch with your experiencing. So it's the same thing in terms of thinking about this broader case that I'm making for a narrative, for a story about God's self-presence. The other thing, too, is that by appropriating this kind of intellectual story as a story that God is trying to tell us about what it means to be human, or the ways in which others have told stories that seem to counter that position, as we begin to kind of appropriate that, then there's a way in which we ourselves become freer to listen to the ways in which God is telling us who God is, how God wants us to live out our lives, and what are the stories that are most fruitful for actually living out our lives. If we think about faith and stories as a relationship, and I think it comes from Luke's gospel, the one thing needful. That is, it is what is that one thing that we long for, that we desire, that we hunger for? And how is that being expressed to us? How is God leading us to find that one thing needful in a broad tapestry of narrative, whatever that narrative might be? So I say this in the essay. I mean, if you think about, it's not that I'm a science and math geek. I mean, if I didn't have 10 toes, I couldn't get to 20. So, but if you think about Newton and his New World Order, if you think about the breakthroughs in the development of chemistry as a science, if you think about the history of mathematics, there's something profoundly beautiful about these experiences, about these stories. And to think about them as beautiful is to think about the way in which God is telling us a story about God's self. because God is somehow the analog of all that is beautiful. So Augustine says in, I think it's in book 7 of the Confessions, he says, "Late have I loved you, beauty, so ancient and so new." I was listening to an NPR interview, this is quite a while ago. This is she's a math professor at the Rochester Institute of Technology. And her work is in multiple dimensional geometries. And so she was explaining the work that she did, and she was talking about how, the theoretical things that they work on. And the interviewer asked her, and it's like all of you who have English majors or some humanities majors, someone will say to you, well, what's the good of that, right? Doesn't seem to have any practical applications. And I remember her response. Her response says, "I do this because it's beautiful." So she's telling a story, a mathematical story about beauty. And as a Christian, that means she's telling a mathematical story about the beauty of God and God's own intelligence. So the argument I'm making is to think about the relationship of faith and stories in a much broader context, and particularly our commitment to the liberal arts tradition here. That commitment means that there is something that's going on in our tradition that if we pay attention and we take it seriously, it is a significant and a profound way to encounter, again, God's own self-story. Let me just give you a kind of account of the magazine. So that's my shtick. And the magazine, for those of you who haven't had a chance to look at it, I think you'll find it to be a significantly rich resource for this topic of the relationship between stories and narratives. Karen Kiefer has given us an account of the significance behind the development of the Agape Latte program. And I think what's so special and unique about that is that Karen gets men and women from the university to share their faith stories, to share those stories with communities. And we have actual stories in the magazine from Professor Mary Troxell, Jack Dunn, Marina McCoy, Bob Neenan, hello. Bob Newton, no, it's Father Neenan. I can't believe I'm drawing a blank on his first name. Bill, thank you. But we have stories with Alice McDermott and Andrew Greeley on the importance of the sacramental imagination. I'm going to go out on a limb here and suggest to you that I think one of the rich things about the Catholic intellectual tradition is the way in which the imagination gets engaged, and the way in which this imagination is shaped and structured through powerful narratives. So for some of you, I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that the importance of stained glass windows in the Middle Ages, while they're beautiful and magnificent, but those were stories, because most of the people were illiterate. And so how did they learn about their faith? They learned about their faith through the reading of these windows. So the windows are stories. And so the Catholic imagination is shaped by a rich tradition of beauty in its artwork and in its story and in its churches and in the men and women who write poetry and novels and everything else. And so Alice McDermott and Andrew Greeley reinforces how important that is when we think about the sacramental life, the way in which the imagination is engaged in the sacramental life, and how that can be actually kind of enriched and enlarged. I was fortunate last year in the courses that I taught, I had essays turned in by 2 students of mine that just struck me as being significant in terms of this whole narrative of the relationship between faith and story. A young freshman woman, Nicole Devaney, had written an essay about some books she had received at Christmas, and reading those books completely reordered the way in which she wanted to think about her commitment to her faith. And she didn't think, she just thought they would be interesting books to read. But those books had such a profound impact on her own faith journey that she again, made these kind of significant reorientations. I think Catherine Pierre is here. Catherine, raise your hand, just like class. So Catherine had me in a class last year for modernism in the arts. And Catherine has an essay on the relationship of her own faith journey and a piece of music that she listened to. So again, just reinforce the fact that when we think about stories being told, the stories are not just stories in books or short stories, that it really covers the breadth of the way in which the imagination can be engaged through forms of narrative. Tom Groom has his essay on the importance of stories and faith formation in families. And one of the things that I was thinking too, and it's not in my essay, but I thought often that when we think about faith formation, the stories that we tell our children, I mean, do we think about telling the story of Nicaea, the first great council of the ecumenical council of the church? Okay, it may seem boring, but the thing is, it's a story about an important question that the church was really trying to wrestle with, and it was a question that was tearing the church apart, and it's the question that Jesus asked his disciples in Matthew's gospel. Who do you say that I am? And you had two very different answers to that question. And those different answers would have a profound effect on the future life of the church. This is a significant story that everyone ought to be familiar with. But we don't think about it because, well, that's kind of what theologians do. But I'm arguing that, again, if we think about the sacramental imagination, the ways in which stories can communicate, that this is a really important story that people ought to be aware of. Because that council began to answer, and it will always continue to be answered, but at least answered in an important way who Jesus really is. So the magazine then is just, I think, a tremendous resource for those of you who are looking for interesting ways to think about faith and narrative. My friend Tom Hibbs at Baylor has a wonderful essay on the relationship of film to faith and how film can help shape our own faith life. And I'm not talking about, the stuff they run on the History Channel. I mean, I'm talking about movies perhaps you wouldn't even think about that could help shape your faith. And there's a side box, too, that Karen put in there from someone who wrote about, I think, the 100 best movies that one can see that help shape the faith. So let me just end with several injunctions. Tell stories, read stories, and as Augustine heard, tolle lege, take and read.